And I would like to now introduce our next speaker, Wade Sobkowich. Joined the Western Grain Elevator Association in 1997 and was named Executive Director in 2004. Wade graduated with honors from the Assiniboine Community College and the University of Manitoba. After graduation, he worked as an economic development officer for the Manitoba communities of Morris and Gimli between 1994 and 97. Wade grew up on a cattle farm at Fisher Branch, Manitoba. He now lives in Winnipeg with his wife and three children. And Wade is going to talk about the elevator system and their role in grain movement. So please welcome Wade to our meeting today.
Thanks for inviting me here. I'm very pleased to be here, and I've been working for the WGA for a while, and these are the members that I work for. I run a one-person office out of Winnipeg, so if you get a letter from me, I put the stamp on it and lick the envelope and drop it in the mailbox. These are the members, and collectively they handle about 90% of Canada's bulk grain exports and throughout the country and in the ports of Prince Rupert, Vancouver, Thunder Bay, and they pay over $1 billion in rail freight bills. We have some devastating facts about this year's situation. We're not going to get out of this problem until we produce a low volume crop. Demand by farmers for access to the handling system and elevator space far exceeds the supply of available space. We're going to see the quality of the crop we can't move deteriorate over time. Opportunities are being lost. Maybe you read the article about Japan wanting to, or moving to the United States to buy its wheat because of Canada's, the unreliability of some shipments from Canada. And the railways focus is single-minded. They are looking at the operation, at the reduction of operating ratios. Mark and I haven't compared our presentations at all coming into this, and some of it is similar. So I'll try not to get into those too much because Mark's explained them very well. I know everybody knows these things, but it's kind of important as a basis for the discussion. So I just put it on here that in the mid-1990s, in order to bring more efficiencies into the grain transportation system, the railways began doing two things. They began closing inefficient branch lines, and they began offering incentives for multiple car blocks. So the elevator companies responded by rationalizing the system, creating high throughput facilities, creating enough loading capacity to load 100-car unit trains so they could capitalize and capture these incentives, which at the time through quorum, Mark measured that, the majority of that, it varied from year to year, but those rail incentives that the grain companies received were passed through to farmers in the way of trucking premiums. So grain companies have invested heavily in the Western Canadian grain handling system in the last 20 years, and at the same time farmers have become larger and more efficient operators and have to truck their grain longer distances, which means higher costs to you. This has all taken place, these sacrifices have all been made as an industry as we try to maximize grain sales domestically and internationally, and we try to sell grain within peak price periods. We've tried to maintain and reestablish confidence in Canada as a reliable supplier, and we try to reduce costs. A very important statistic here, when we looked at this, in hindsight, looking back over the last 20, 30 years and seeing where did we capture these efficiencies? Are we more efficient, or where do the efficiencies lie? In the fall of 1994, Canada exported 8.7 million tons of grain. This fall, we exported 7.4 million tons of grain. So what happened? Come back to that later. Mark went over some of these numbers, but as you know, the crop is 33% larger than it was last year at 76 million tons. Total rail car shortfall right now is 55,000 rail cars, which means that there's 5 million tons of grain that grain companies have put in orders for from the railways that have not been filled. So that, I think that answers or partly answers a question asked previously is, is it the chicken and egg thing? Are the railways not providing enough capacity because the grain companies aren't asking for the shipping, or is it the other way around? Grain companies are asking for the shipping. 55,000 cars have not been fulfilled. In the fall period, in the very best week, the railway spotted somewhere between 9,500 and 10,000 rail cars in the very best week. Some people say, some of my members say they did hit 10,000, but others say they didn't. They didn't hit that. It was closer to 9,500, and but that's the very best week. Even though they had promised earlier in the year to provide 5,500 rail cars per railway in each week. I don't know if you can make that out, but this is a typical breakout of how 10,000 cars would be split up for a given week. In the Vancouver corridor, you would see 2,000 cars on CN and 2,600 on CP for a total of 4,600 cars going to Vancouver. Then for Prince Rupert, you'd see about 1,400 for Thunder Bay and Churchill and direct east movements to the transfer elevators. In the St. Lawrence, you would see about 2,200 rail cars, and then another 1,300 to the U.S., and 800 domestic for a total of 10,300 cars. I just put that up there so you can see how, if we were to get 10,000 rail cars in a week from the railways combined, that's roughly how it would split out. However, since mid-December, the railways are providing about half that number. They're providing about 5,000 cars per week, combined total. And since the beginning of the crop year, grain shipping is down by about 6% over last year, and these declines are growing all the time. They were level at one point, then they went down to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and unless something changes, we're going to see the difference between this year's shipping and last year's shipping fall more dramatically. Country stock positions are holding at about 3.5 million tons, which is, as Mark said, the absolute limit of the system's working capacity. Primary stocks are about 29% higher than at the same time last year. And grain elevators are now only able to accept deliveries at the rate they load out, something that Mark mentioned. Dwell times, which is an extremely frustrating phenomenon. Dwell times are as high as 20 days. So what happens is when they do bring you a train and you do load it, and you have to load it within 24 hours, otherwise you face penalties and you face a stripping back of the rail incentive. So you load it in a day, and then it sits on your track by your elevator facility for 11 to 20 days before the railways come and pick it up. To compound the problem, grain companies are experiencing out-of-sequence cars or selective spotting of empty car orders in the country, and this impacts the sequencing of cars arriving at the port for the vessel. So that's another problem in the logistics. And grain companies, we continue to receive considerable and increasing feedback from producer groups as well as individual producers. I personally get calls every day from farmers who are upset by what's happening and upset at grain companies by what's happening. Some grain companies indicated they will not accept non-contracted deliveries of grains and oilseeds for the rest of the crop year. And the trade is moving to 100% advanced contracted sales. And this is a policy that will probably remain until the next short crop. Few new contracts are likely to be offered until the rail backlog shows some signs of clearing, and grain companies, it's a terrible situation. They simply cannot do more business until the old contracts have been fulfilled, and they can only bring in grain at the rate it's being loaded out into rail cars. Mark mentioned this. We have 50 vessels waiting off the west coast, 17 at Prince Rupert, 13 in Prince Rupert and 37 in Vancouver, somewhere about there. Mark's numbers were probably a bit more up to date than mine. And we have several in the St. Lawrence, and this is unheard of. Vessel demurrage, which is the penalties we pay to have those vessels waiting for grain to arrive, ranges between $11,000 and $25,000 per day. And last tally, we've paid over $25 million since the beginning of the crop year on vessel demurrage, but I'm sure that number is much higher today. It's growing every day. And these are direct costs incurred by the grain companies due to them trying to follow the railway's plan, it not coming through, and our logistics systems being out of whack because of it. Partially filled vessels continue to be held at anchor at both West Coast ports. With grain showing up in pieces just in time, we end up loading multiple vessels, while some wait 30 to 50 days for the balance of the cargo. Each time a vessel is brought in, berthing costs about $10,000. In addition, with the limited anchorage points in Vancouver, many vessels are at Victoria Island, and it takes more notice to bring them in, about 10 hours notice to be able to bring in a vessel from that location. And once our contract period is over with the customer, we enter into a contract extension period, and in most cases this runs half to a full percentage of value per ton for the cargo for 7 days. So the costs for contract extension penalties start at about $500,000 and go up from there. And Mark mentioned about the stocks at terminal elevators. They're less than half than what we had about last year. There's significant untapped port terminal unload capacity in Vancouver, Prince Rupert, and Thunder Bay. Overall capacity of the grain industry to handle unloads. We did some calculations this year and figured that we could probably handle about 14,000 rail cars per week without having to make any investments in the system. We're not suggesting the answer is for the railways to provide 14,000 rail cars per week, although it would be great if they did. But it shows that the bottlenecks are not caused by the grain companies. And grain companies could increase that number of 14,000 rail cars with some added investment, added crews, added equipment, that sort of thing. But it's difficult to justify those investments when you're not getting anywhere near 14,000 rail cars per week. My numbers are a little bit different from Mark's here. This just shows carry in at the beginning of the year, production of the year, exports of the year, domestic use, and then carry out at the end of the year. So hopefully you can see that. You can see it all the way from 06, 07, all the way to 12, 13. These are difficult to calculate. There's not one place that has all of these numbers, but we we had analysts look at it and come up with these numbers. So carry out is 4.3, 2.8, 6.6, 8.5, 5, 3, 4 million tons at the end of the year. And then I have 3 scenarios at the bottom there. And the first scenario is if the railways keep providing 5,000 rail cars per week combined like they are today, then our carryout at the end of the crop year is going to be 30 million tons. If the railways can go back to providing 10,000 rail cars per week, which was their best week in the fall period, some would argue, then our carryout at the end of the year is going to be 23 million tons. And if the railways could even provide 14,000 cars per week from this week up to the end of the crop year, which is the limit of the system's handling and unload capacity, we're still going to have an 18 million ton carryout at the end of the year. Sobering numbers for me. So let's take the value of that crop that farmers aren't going to get paid for. Price per ton at today's values to the farmer can be averaged. I just used a straight average between today's prices of wheat and canola and came up with $275.50 per ton. Use whatever number you think is realistic, but if you use my numbers and you end up with a 23 a million ton carryout, that's $6.5 billion that farmers aren't getting paid for. And if the railways keep providing service at the level that they are today, we're going to end up with a 30 million ton carryout. That's $8 billion of value that is still sitting on your farms. And prices have been declining, as you know. Everybody knows that. That's what everyone's talking about. If we used October prices, when the prices began declining because of lack of capacity, but if we used October prices and use a number of $350, $750 per ton, then you would end up with, well, you could do the math. You end up, I think, with 8 billion or 7.5 billion and 10 billion or something like that. So get asked a lot, what is it that we're doing as grain companies? Why aren't we, addressing this problem in some way? Surely we could come up with some solutions here and get the grain moving again. And we have been for many years trying to get some of the rules, laws, etc. in place so that we have equal bargaining power with the railways. We don't have that today, but for our part, we've been trying to bring grain in from farmers on a first contract and first in basis, generally speaking. However, companies are also trying to match the product with the right vessel, so it doesn't always work out that way on a first contract and first in basis. Sometimes it's, you need that canola for that vessel, so you're calling that forward right now. We're trying to fill up space in Thunder Bay because our country elevator system is full, and Thunder Bay has a lot of space. Even though they're not shipping out of Thunder Bay, they have a lot of storage space. And when I say they're not shipping, it's because the port's closed for the winter. But we haven't been able to get adequate shipping to Thunder Bay, just like to everywhere else. So that didn't work out as well. Rail service to eastern and U.S. corridors is so far behind that our ability to fill up Thunder Bay terminals is disappearing. The other thing that we've been doing is increasing daily and weekly unload capacity through capital investments in machinery and equipment and labor at the port terminal facilities. We have crews and space at all port facilities to unload the rail cars as they come in, and they berth and load vessels immediately upon arrival of the product. And terminals have also made progress in loading in the rain. In the past, there have been times when rain in Vancouver has been an issue. Couldn't load the vessel because it's raining too hard. So that's delayed things. Now we have a tarping system with feeder holes, and terminals are all loading in the rain. So that's not a bottleneck. The marketers from the different grain companies are being flexible with each other on stock swaps, which enables terminals to clear some vessels quicker and increase buffer storage space for new unloads. Similar to what the wheat board would have done when they were shipping, they would have a wheat vessel go to different terminals, get it filled, and get it out of there. Companies are working with each other to do stock swaps to some level of capacity. And all grain companies are prepared to operate and have been operating on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis if and when the rail cars are there. There's no point in operating 24 hours a day if you don't have any rail cars to unload, and all you can do is sweep the floors of the terminal. But as long as we have proper notice, that's not a bottleneck. If we're getting cars, we'll do anything to load them, we'll do anything to unload them. So, a lot of questions. We had ministers Lyle Stewart and McMorris and Boyd fly into Winnipeg on Friday and meet with myself, and and a number of my members to, they're under instructions from your premier to take a look at it, analyze it, come up with some solutions to this problem. And so we spent a lot of time talking to them. It was a good discussion. So this is what we told them, that in the short term we need two things, and how we're going to get it exactly, you know, we can talk about what the levers are. There aren't many. But what we need, first of all, is added capacity from the railways. This is, you know, back from the earlier slide where I said, what happened to the efficiency gains? How come we're moving less in 2014 than we did in 1994? And it's because all of the efficiency gains have rested with the railways. They've been converted into returns to shareholders, and we're not any more efficient as a handling system because we're not able to move more. And companies and farmers have done a significant amount to improve system capacity, including railway efficiency, with minimum return. The reason is because the railways continue to drive down their costs, taking out crews, locomotives, and rolling stock at our expense and affecting our performance and efficiency. We've heard the argument from the railways that they simply can't add capacity, that we can't add more cars on the freeway during rush hour to solve the problem. And this is where maybe Mark and I don't see it exactly the same. We think the railways can add and should add more cars. And CP announced that it's decreased its workforce by 4,500 people. It reduced the rail cars in its fleet by 11,000 and pulled 4,000 locomotives since 2012. And CN took similar steps under Hunter Harrison during their period of operating ratio decline in the early 2000s. And they've done all of this to maximize return to shareholders. So we think the capacity is there, and they should be bringing more capacity online. The second thing we need is for the railways to go full out for the rest of the crop year, and we need a recovery plan that addresses how the railways plan to add capacity to bring the carryout down, especially for port movements, with West Coast being the priority. And I guess I should have added a third thing. Really, it breaks out into 3 points. The third thing we need is recovery plans and better information. Companies have sold basis the capacity information that they got from the railways. So they put on sales programs, they manage their logistics to bring in vessels to execute on their contracts. Basis what the railway said, which was we're going to give you between 5,000 to 5,500 cars a week this crop year, and we haven't been getting them. So we need better plans from the railways so we're not incurring these vessel demurrage costs and these contract extension penalties. We need accurate information on the rail cars they're going to bring.
Wade, can you repeat those staff, rolling stock, and locomotive cuts in CP?
Yeah, CP reduced their staff by 4,500. They reduced their locomotives and their fleet by 400. And they reduced their rolling stock by 11,000. That's 11,000 rail cars. And that's within the last year. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about the grain revenue entitlement. Mark referenced that it shouldn't be referred to as a cap. We agree. We don't think it's a cap. It's a revenue entitlement to the railways. And so those are the short-term things we need. How we're going to get them, we need to talk about. But one thing isn't the solution in our view. It's the grain revenue entitlement. Removing it would be a big mistake. Adjusting it is dangerous. It's important to understand the way it works. I think Mark explained it pretty well. It's an inflationary control mechanism. It ensures that any escalation in freight rates associated with moving grain is consistent with the rate of inflation. It starts with railway revenues on each of CN and CPR in the base year 2000, and is based on revenues the railways generated prior to the GRE being in place. The Canadian Transportation Agency then adjusts the GRE value each year based on volumes of grain hauled, the average distance it's hauled, and inflation. This ensures the railway companies are guaranteed a rate of return that is equal to the base year. The inflationary component is indexed based on fuel costs, employment costs, and other factors that were in place in 2000, 2001. Any efficiencies that were generated by the railways since then are captured and retained by the railways themselves. So, for example, the cost of fuel in the GRE is based on the consumption rate of the technology of a locomotive in the year 2000. If they have, and they do have, more efficient locomotives, that doesn't come out of the GRE. That's an efficiency that's captured and retained by the railways. At the same time, as the price of fuel increases, the GRE is increased upwards. So the railways do get to capture productivity gains for those things, reduction in labor costs, etc. The grain revenue entitlement applies to grain routed for export through Canadian West Coast ports and eastern shipments ending in Armstrong and Thunder Bay. It does not apply to grain originating in Canada shipped to the US or Mexico or east of Thunder Bay. So it would technically apply to grain shipped to Churchill if it was carried by a Class 1 carrier, but the carrier currently serving Churchill is not a prescribed railway, and so the portion of movements to Churchill that is not covered by CN is not eligible under the grain revenue entitlement. And so we were being challenged on the grain revenue entitlement a lot lately, and so we reached some conclusions on it. It doesn't place a cap on the amount of revenue the railways can earn. And it's calculated on a per ton basis, so we don't think it should be referred to as a cap. Removing the grain revenue entitlement is risky. There's no evidence that shows that shippers would get better service if it were eliminated. In fact, there's existing evidence that poor service and insufficient capacity would remain. And it's not even, I say the best example, but it's not even an example, it's the situation. Of those 55,000 cars that I told you about that are outstanding orders with the railways, half of those are in non-regulated corridors. So right now, the railways can charge whatever they want for shipping to the United States, yet half our shortfall is on shipments to the United States. I think that speaks volumes about what removing or adjusting the revenue cap would do. We feel very strongly that our best ability to correct the logistical problems we have is to ensure a balance and accountability between railways and shippers, and an obligation on the railways to provide adequate capacity and service. Here's a comparison of the different consequences to shippers versus the different consequences to railways for poor performance. I'm using CN as an example, but I could have just as easily pulled this information from CP tariffs. So adequacy of equipment is number one. The consequences to the shipper for rejecting a suitable car, $250 per day. The consequences to CN for providing an unsuitable car, nothing. Supply and acceptance of rail cars. The consequences to a shipper for not being able to take delivery of ordered rail cars. $100 per rail car, or $150 to switch fee per rail car, or $250 under other circumstances. The consequences to CN for failing to supply ordered rail cars, nothing. Timeliness of service. Consequence to shipper for not loading or unloading rail cars within the prescribed time. $87 per rail car per day. Consequence to CN for failing to deliver rail cars at a time set by CN. Nothing. Those are a few examples. The Class 1 railways have the legislative right to unilaterally determine, impose, and apply both the categories of non-performance and set the penalty amount. Grain shippers, we don't object to being subject to these disciplines, but what's absent are the commensurate penalties applied to the railways for their failure to perform. The cost to the shipper of a missed shipment is the value of the commodity delivered to the customer of the shipper. In other words, it's far more painful for the shipper than the carrier to miss a delivery. The shipper already has an incentive to get the delivery made on time. In this circumstances, the carriers suffer very little and is compensated by the unilaterally imposed tariff. So why don't the grain shippers just sit down and negotiate into their contracts with the railways these penalties? Perhaps we should start with developing producer contracts with penalties that get paid to the grain company for failure to call that grain forward during the time that it was supposed to have been called forward, and then the grain companies can recover that from the railways for their failure to bring the rail cars. There's a very good explanation for why shippers have been unable to succeed in negotiating commensurate railway penalties under commercial terms. It's a reason the Rail Freight Service Review Panel agreed upon and noted in their final report. And they say, finally, it has long been recognized in transportation law that regulations are required to address the potential abuse of market power by the railways. And they go on to say, this railway market power results in an imbalance in the commercial relationship between the railways and other stakeholders. So in other words, we can sit down and try and negotiate penalties with the railways all we want. They ain't going to agree.
What if the government did that?
Mandatory penalties to the railways. Now we're getting somewhere. So you just hold on for a few minutes. I don't mind the applause, but if you just hold, I'll be getting to that a little bit later on in the presentation. And I also just brought this up because it's under the Competition Act, and it talks about market share and abuse of market share when they put an industry under the microscope. The Competition Act, sections 78 and 79, are instructive. The Competition Bureau's general approach in evaluating allegations of abuse of dominance is as follows. A market share of less than 35% will generally not give rise to the concerns of market power. A market share of 35% or more will generally prompt further examination. In the case of a group of firms alleged to be jointly dominant, a combined market share equal to or exceeding 65% will generally prompt further examination. CN and CPR jointly have 94% of the market. But it's not even a situation where you say jointly. If you have a duopoly that has over, 65%. As Mark said, these aren't duopolies. They're dual monopolies. And there's a difference. If you have a duopoly, you have a choice between one or the other. If you're an elevator planted in the middle of Saskatchewan with a CN line running past you, you're beholden to a monopoly. So it's a dual monopoly situation. But the railways aren't subject to the Competition Act in the same way. They're exempt because they fall under the Canada Transportation Act. So what was the government's solution to all of this as a result of all of the reviews that we've participated in and the countless meetings and trips to Ottawa that I've personally been on to try and talk about what the solutions are? In March of 2013, and after years and years and multiple studies, the federal government introduced Bill C-52 to address all of this and try and bring about the necessary backstop for balanced accountability. It gave shippers the right to a service level agreement, and if one could not be negotiated, it would be, the service level agreement would be put to an arbitrator for a decision. If the railways failed to adhere to an arbitrated service level agreement, then the Canadian Transportation Agency could investigate and apply a fine to the railway of up to $100,000 per occurrence, which is a very small amount for the railway. For you and me, $100,000 is a lot of money. For the railway, it's the cost of doing business. But C-52 was flawed from the start. It started with the premise that the legislation needed to balance the interests of shippers and railways. Bureaucrats and legislators inherently look for balance. And if both sides to a problem are unhappy, then it must be good policy. So the process starts, practically speaking, the process starts with a negotiation between a shipper and a railway. It sounds good on the surface, but a negotiation implies give and take. So you're starting with a situation where there's your bargaining power. The railway's bargaining power is here, shipper's bargaining power is here, and now you have to negotiate something, which is give and take, so you don't net out at an even point. You net out at the end of your negotiations at imbalance still. So it was a flawed premise. What do shippers need to give up in order to get commitments on capacity and good service? There's nothing more we can give up because, as I've demonstrated, the railways have the ability to set penalties unilaterally through their tariffs. So we're already paying, and we already have the disciplines in place to the shippers. What the legislators missed is that we're starting from a point of commercial imbalance, and therefore the legislation necessarily needed to be imbalanced the other way in order to net out an overall balance. Some other problems with the bill. The arbitrator can't rule on penalties in a service level agreement, so you start with negotiations with the railways. You sit down, you try and work something out. The railways aren't going to agree to put penalties in the agreement with you. They're not going to agree to any set of disciplines whatsoever because they don't have to. So there you are, you can't reach agreement. So you go to the arbitrator and you say, Mr. Arbitrator, we can't reach a negotiated agreement with the railway, so can you please rule for us? And the arbitrator says, yes, I will, but I can't rule on penalties. It's out of scope for me. And if you want a commercial dispute resolution process in your agreement, I can't rule on that either. It's out of scope for me. And once I do get an agreement, if I do arbitrate an agreement that applies to both parties, it's only good for 1 year. And if the railways fail to perform according to that agreement, when they pay a penalty, it goes to the government, not to the party that's been harmed. To which we said to the government, tongue-in-cheek, well, maybe all of the tariff penalties we pay to the railways should be paid to the government. So anyway, we think Bill C-52 was a problem, and I don't think that we're going to see a lot of people, a lot of grain companies even taking one step down the path towards negotiating them, because at the end of the day, you won't end up with anything guaranteed. When C-52 was put forward to the House of Commons, we did, along with our organization is a member of a larger and broader shipper group coalition called the Coalition of Rail Shippers, and we got together with them and hired a number of transportation lawyers and looked at the legislation and said, can we fix this? Can we propose some amendments to the government that makes it usable for us? And we came up with, the lawyers came up with 50 or 60 amendments, to which guys like me said, you can't propose 50 or 60 amendments to the government, they're not going to do it. We have to bring it down to a manageable number. So we came up with 6. There were 6 sets of amendments that in principle we wanted made to Bill C-52. One was to better define adequate and suitable accommodation and service obligations, which puts better fence posts around the obligations of the railways to start with. The second thing we wanted was to allow the arbitrator to rule on penalties in a service level agreement. So if a shipper wanted penalties paid to them for the railway's failure, the arbitrator could look at that and rule on some fair penalties to go in the agreement. We wanted to allow the arbitrator to include a dispute resolution process in the agreement. So we're not always before courts or before the agency with the railways. We can have a quick, 1 week long, very efficient and cost-effective process to resolve disputes within the agreement. Allow single shipper tariffs to be eligible for final offer arbitration. That's complicated and beyond me. Allow the shipper to identify the matter in dispute before the arbitrator. The way the Bill C-52 was written, it would allow the railways to argue that, so the shipper would say, I have a problem, and would present the problem to the arbitrator, and the railway would say, well, that's not really the problem is this. And then there would be a debate about what the real problem is. And we wanted to have it so that it was the shipper that identified the problem. And we wanted to remove the ability of the railways to use the network as an excuse for poor performance. The railways tend to, they like to say, well, it's not just our fault, it's the network, there's a linkage, there's the terminals, there's the vessels, there's the country elevators, we're not getting the cars back fast enough, and they will make a number of, what I call just, throw out a number of red herrings, and we said, no, we can't have the railways use the network as an excuse. Every other part of the network is accountable for their own performance. It's that section in the middle that isn't. So we think the railways need to be held accountable for their portion of the logistics system. The government didn't accept any of our amendments, which is probably why we won't be using service level agreement legislation anytime soon. So what are the long-term solution ideas? We have a number of them, and I'll just go through them sort of quickly here. It's based on the premise that we're starting from imbalance, and either you have a commercial system with competition that straightens these things out, or if you don't have it and you can't see a way to get it in the short term, then you need to prop up the system with legislation to create balance that would otherwise naturally occur in a competitive environment. So the definition of adequate and suitable accommodation and service obligations is seen as a very important one, and one that we have proposed to the government many times and we will continue to propose. Canadian Transportation Agency to award damages. We think the agency should be empowered to award damages, both those directly related to costs incurred or lost opportunities, and those that could be punitive in nature to the railways. Shippers would have to be subject to penalties as well for canceled orders. Right now, what can happen, and the system allows for it, although I'm assured by my members that it isn't happening in today's environment, it has happened in the past. When you get rationed back, you inflate your orders because you know you're going to get rationed back, and you have a real number you're trying to hit. So in order for this, our proposals to work, shippers themselves, grain companies, would have to be subject to penalties for canceled orders or unused rail cars. We think the agency would have to have investigative powers to conduct level of service investigations of their own volition based on complaints by shippers, or observe behavior by means of various monitoring programs and provisions. Penalties for poor service. To ensure that railway service is and continues to be adequate, there must be financial penalties payable by the railways to shippers after the railways have committed to spot cars. Once a railway has agreed to spot cars, penalties should apply if they fail to deliver on time. Daily metric for spotting performance must apply, and once the train has been loaded, the railway should be held accountable for arriving at a destination within a specific time frame. And that gets to the earlier point about you got to have legislative penalties to the railways. And penalties should reduce the revenue entitlement. So in other words, the railways can't simply pay those penalties and consider it included in the revenue entitlement formula, so they net out even, and it just ends up on the cost side of the ledger in that formula. It needs to be an actual penalty that reduces the revenue cap threshold that the railways need to come under. Other solution ideas: railway service plans. Unlike the proposed legislation and regulations, under the proposed legislation and regulations, the railways would establish a rolling service plan sent out each day to the shippers, indicating the plan for spotting at country elevators and the associated load date for each elevator spot for the next 7 days. They would establish and communicate expected times of arrival. This information would form the basis for performance measurements, performance standards, and contractual obligations. The regulations could then be established to indicate that these performance standards could be deemed contractual obligations within the railway tariff and would carry the above noted minimum standards of service with the associated penalties for failure to perform unless otherwise agreed by the relevant parties. Fast-tracked arbitration process, quite simply, that's a quick and easy way to resolve minor disputes or location-specific disputes between railways and shippers. Today, we don't have that ability. The only tool we really have, or the only arrow in our quiver, is to go and do a level of service complaint, which is after the fact. The damage has to have already been done. It costs $1 million in legal fees, and it takes a year or two just to get a decision from the agency that says, yes, shippers, you're right, but they can't award damages. You then need to take that decision and go to civil court and take the railways to court to try and recover those damages, and the railways fight you every step of the way. So we think a fast-track arbitration process that limits the ability of the railways to throw resources and expertise and lawyers at the process, just a simple process that you might find under a commodity exchange or something to help resolve these types of disputes. In addition to these, the big picture solution includes looking at ways to increase competition between the railways. We've been thinking about how you can do it without making the system less efficient. There are ways, I'm sure we haven't been able to land on one. You look at joint line running rights, you look at those types of things. It would have to be very closely analyzed. It would bring a ton of questions. It would open up a ton of holes that would need to be analyzed and plugged in some way. And the other thing that needs to happen in the long term is a substantial investment in infrastructure to accommodate more traffic. And one other thing that occurred to us is that there have been so many studies and projects on railway service and rail capacity funded by the government over the last years. What if we were to, or the government were to do a study on how to help, how to get locomotives to run better in cold weather? We know, it sounds funny, but we know that they have to shorten the length of their trains, and they use that as an excuse. Well, we can't. Mark showed you the graph, how it dips down in December and it stays down for the cold weather, and then well, how come we can't look at ways to maintain service during cold weather? And should the railways be bringing on more locomotives, more rail cars, more crews during cold weather? What's the obligation on them to do that? So I have some concluding statements, and then I'll be done. Whatever the solutions are, they need to be developed with some realities in mind. The railways have explained that they were not aware of the large crop this year. Actually, the railway companies were made of this year's record crop in early September by grain companies directly. We have presentations that prove that. And that we've told them that in early September that the crop was going to be over 70 million tons. In addition, companies have been signaling demand to the railways on an individual basis each week since the beginning of September. What is apparent is that the railways do not have a process for forecasting demand and movement for grain. They don't ask for an aggregate demand number, nor do they request demand forecasts by corridor. We can only conclude that, unlike we see in competitive industries, demand forecasting is not a key factor in the railway's decision-making process on planning supply. The grain industry is seeing an increase in global demand for cereals, oilseeds, and pulse crops. And there's an opportunity for strong commodity prices. The railway capacity problems have been keeping the supply and demand such that the prices in the country are artificially low. The rising population and general increase in income is supporting this increase in global demand. If Canada expects to grow exports of potash and coal and oil and grain, etc., there must be a competitive or regulatory rail environment to require the railways to provide added capacity and better service. In a normal commercial setting, competition will respond to opportunity. The rail freight market does not operate in a normal manner. And if there isn't real competition, then the only option for the disadvantaged parties to artificially reestablish this balance through legislation or regulation. And as Mark said, the railways are operating in a predictable manner. If you or I worked for them, we would probably do the same thing. They're trying to make increase returns, maximize returns to shareholders. We've heard the railways make the statement that one doesn't build a church for Easter Sunday. And they say that as an analogy to say we can't put all this surge capacity in place for the peak periods. But if this were true, the rail industry would be the only one of which we are aware that enjoys the benefit of using its assets 100% to 100% of capacity at all times. They are really a utility, not unlike Manitoba Hydro. I use for an example because I'm from Manitoba. Hydro has to build to peak capacity because you can't leave people out in the cold. And by the way, my church is fit for Easter Sunday. So it's a fundamental of business that any company must build excess capacity to service the needs of a growing marketplace. Railways are providers of service to customers, being grain shippers. They should not be allowed to dictate the fashion in which Canadian shippers and exporters market their produced products to the world, especially when doing so results in severe economic harm to the industry and producers. The industry, shippers, and government have a huge challenge ahead of us in trying to determine how to meet increased demand. We do not want to re-regulate the entire system and have centralized planning. However, we do need selective and effective regulation to aid where competition does not exist. In my mind, it comes down to the following. The Prime Minister's office needs to decide whether it continues to be acceptable to the government to have Hunter Harrison and Claude Margeau acting on their behalf as the economic overlords of Western Canada. That's an extreme statement, but that's what's happening. Is it acceptable to the government that the railways can determine the export priorities for Canada based on the returns to their shareholders as opposed to the returns to the citizens of Canada? Thank you.